Good evening. Welcome to New Ostrog again. And we've completed the book of Genesis and discussed a little bit about our embarkment onto the book of Exodus. We discussed Moses, what his role was in Egypt, and why he fled from Egypt. We know then that Moses came to Midian, and we see that he went from being the prince of Egypt to a shepherd of his father-in-law's sheep. And he was quite a long time in Sinai in a kind of exile. It took a long time for Moses to come to the point where he could be God's special servant in the way that his calling would demand. Somehow the prince of Egypt had to become reconciled with the shepherd in the wilderness of Sinai and with the deliverer and lawgiver for Israel, the special servant of God. We will hear a little later God testifying, "I called Moses as my servant because he was the meekest man on earth." But how and by what process did Moses learn such meekness? His struggle was first of all to discover himself, to enter into his own person, contemplate the reality of his being. Here was this orphan who had survived massacre of his fellow Hebrew infants, boys, and raised by a foster parent in the palace of the one who was at least among the three mightiest men on earth at the time, the Pharaoh. And now he finds himself drawn back to his own people, defends one of the Hebrew slaves who's being beaten. And there is already an inner contradiction within Moses. He knows that he's not that person who he appears to be, that his station and position in life is inauthentic, that somehow that authenticity of being and of life is still evading Moses. And now he has to flee and takes up the role of a shepherd, marries Zipporah, and becomes her father's servant, really. From a prince of Egypt to the servant of a nomad, shepherd. There in Mount Sinai, he has both the peace and an awe-inspiring wilderness that helps him in his meditation, his contemplation, his search for himself, his search to be reconciled with the reality of his personhood, to end a kind of inner alienation that he feels within him, to come to a kind of authenticity of life. And finally, in the fullness of time, God prepares to call him, this man who has now learned meekness, has now come into an accord with the fact that in fact he is a Hebrew, not an Egyptian, and that his people are in bondage, and that there is a covenant with his people, and that God is faithful to that covenant. So there, the voice of God, the energies of God, are manifested in the burning bush. And it is really at the burning bush, when Moses sees this great wonder, that he finally becomes reconciled with himself, and his heart becomes open to the God who had revealed himself through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, and through Joseph. And now he's open both in heart and mind, and emotionally stable and settled enough that God calls him to his special service. But although the story of Moses is very powerful, it still is a story about us. It's a story about how often we are alienated from our own personhood, how often we fall into an unauthentic life, and how much we need to examine our own selves to become reconciled with ourself and to really discover who we actually are and come to an authentic life in a process that at the same time opens our heart toward God and then opens our mind toward God and settles our emotions and stabilizes them so that we can be of service to God and man. For no one can be of service to God who is not of service to man. And Moses now is about to become the servant of God and the servant of the Hebrews and the servant of all future generations of Israelites and the servant of those future generations of Christians who are to come. Our own struggle to find ourselves, to bring ourselves together, to unite ourselves within ourselves, and to end our own alienation, to come into a reality and an understanding and a reconciliation with our own self, so that we can be of use and benefit. And first of all to ourselves, and so that we can truly serve God in knowledge and in truth. This is a part of the struggle of each one of us. And really this struggle of Moses is a revelation about each one of us in the path of our life and our own inner struggle. We could, of course, be quite mediocre and never reconcile ourselves with ourselves and never gain an authentic life. It happens to perhaps even the majority of people on this earth, but it is not what we're called to. It really does not help us to open our hearts fully and completely to God. We develop a religious ideology or religious feelings, but really to develop an authenticity of life and to come to know our own selves by knowing our own self. And then, with that knowledge, opening ourselves to true faith in God, a faith that comes from a deep understanding and knowledge, a faith that is authentic because we have become authentic, a life in Christ that can become authentic because our own life has become authentic. You see, we're not called upon simply to say, yes, I believe in Jesus, and I have faith in, I have faith in Christ, sure. Because I follow this code or this law or this rule or some ideology. To have a complete orientation of our soul toward the will of God that comes forth from a knowledge of ourself and a reconciliation with our own self, an authentic personhood, intentionally using our energies toward coming into an accord with the will of God. This is what we're called upon as Orthodox Christians. And this is what Moses had to discover, to find, and to come back from his alienation into full communion with the God of his ancestors, the God who created the heavens and the earth and revealed himself to man. And this is our calling and our path also. And may God give us the strength and the grace and the desire to follow such a path and end our alienation and come to a full reconciliation with ourselves and with God. Amen.